Have you ever used the wrong side of a nail? Probably not. I like to assume you're not an idiot. But it would result in a really different scenario if you tried using the flat head of a nail instead of the pointy side. And why? Well, physics has an answer for that too, and today we're going to be talking about something called pressure, which tells us that the amount of force that we use is important, but where we put that force, that makes the difference. So let's go ahead and talk about the basics of pressure. Pressure tells us how concentrated a force is. We can find pressure by taking the amount of force that we are using and dividing it by the area that force is spread out over. And while the force that we're using is usually a constant, the area that we're dealing with is not. And so if I look at something like this nail right here, this nail has one side which is flat, and I'm intended to hit this with a hammer, and it has another side that's pointed. And so if I want to drive this nail into something, I will have to use a lot more force to drive the flat end than the pointy end, and that's because of the pressure that the nail applies onto whatever it's going into. So for instance, if I have a paper plate, I can smack the paper plate repeatedly with the flat end and nothing happens. But if I use the same amount of force and I smack the paper plate with the pointy end, you can see it goes right through. And so once again, same amount of force, but the flat side versus the pointy side gives me very different effects. And so that's a measurement of the pressure that the nail was applying onto the paper plate. Now, sometimes we want something to apply a whole lot of pressure, usually when we want to go through something. And sometimes when we want something to not go through something, we're going to want low pressure situations. So let's take the example of your teeth. Okay, your jaw applies roughly the same amount of pressure in all places, but you have two very different types of teeth in your mouth. The ones in front are pointy. They're used for biting into things. That's a high pressure situation. We have a lot of force, we have less area that force is being applied to. Now, the ones in the back, those are used for chewing things. They're not very good for biting into things though. Those have a much wider area. They're a lot flatter, but your jaw still applies the same amount of force, and so that's a low pressure situation. So we can go from a flat side, which has a lot of area and therefore low pressure, to the pointy side, which has a much smaller surface area and therefore a lot more pressure. And we can use these in different situations. Does air have weight? It seems like kind of a silly question, but it actually really applies right here. And so I want you to think about this for just a moment. If you took a balloon and you weighed it on a scale and then you blew it up and put it back on the same scale, would the weight of the balloon have changed? And the answer is yes. Air does technically have weight. It's made out of small particles like atoms. Atoms have mass, and anything that has mass has weight because gravity will pull down on it. And so even though air doesn't weigh very much, it definitely does weigh something. And there's a lot of air. In fact, right above you, if you were to kind of trace your outline and go all the way up to outer space, all of that air is pressing down onto you. And that's what we refer to as air pressure. Air pressure is the second application of pressure, which you should know for this class. You need to know that it's measured with a tool called the barometer, and that it can be high or low. And whether we have high pressure or low pressure is frequently determined by the weather that we're having. So they'll talk about high pressure fronts and low pressure fronts moving in. That's just weather people speak for talking about how much the air actually is pressing down on planet Earth. And you, as somebody who is relatively close to planet Earth, bear all of that pressure. So you should know about air pressure. And that's definitely something that you should kind of keep tucked away in the back of your head because it will come in handy later. But for right now, just understand that there is a column of air above you that is pressing down on you, and that is the air pressure that you're experiencing. So, by the end of this video, you should have learned the following three things. Number one, you should know that pressure is a measurement of how concentrated our force is going to be. And how concentrated it is depends on the surface area that force is being applied to. Number 2, you should know that the equation for pressure is force divided by area. And so therefore, the bigger our area becomes, the smaller our force is. And the opposite is also true. And finally, number 3, you should know that air pressure or atmospheric pressure is a thing, and it's the weight of all of the air above us pressing down on us, and that we measure it using a tool called the barometer. Hopefully you've got all 3 of those things, and I'll see you in class.